And I'm very pleased now to turn to our fourth presenter, Ms. Karina Lester. Ms. Lester grew up in the remote community of Mimili in the far northwest of South Australia. She has a long history as a keen anti-nuclear activist, sharing not only her late father's story, but her grandmother's story of the British nuclear tests in the 1950s to 1960s, and speaks strongly about the impacts felt by her people. Karina is an ICAN Ambassador and participated in the negotiating conference of the TPNW, and she's played a leading role in campaigns to prevent international nuclear waste storage in South Australia. Ms. Lester, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Secretary-General. Let me get comfortable. And thank you, Mexican's presidency, Mr. President, for this amazing opportunity to be here. I'm no scientist. I'm going to be speaking as a second-generation survivor of the British nuclear tests. Before I do want to acknowledge that I am on traditional lands of Turtle Island, but I want to acknowledge First Nations peoples who are present in this room as well. As I mentioned, I'm a second-generation survivor, and I'm speaking from my people's impact felt by the British nuclear tests that took place in 1953. And in Australia, it continued that program through the 50s and 60s as well. Renee, I'm going to get a slide if you can. So my late father, Yami Lester, was a young boy at the age of 12 when Totem 1 detonated on his traditional lands at Emu Fields. He went blind 4 years later at the age of 16. His parents were living in a very remote community in South Australia. It was a pastoral property at the time, a place called Wallatinna, which is where I currently reside as well. This black mist fell over the community in that 1953, and that was 70 years ago when the black mist rolled over that community. Old people had died, and many became violently ill. And as my father, after 4 years, a gradual loss of his sight, illness was unfolded in the next generations and generations to come as well. And sickness is through our communities, 70 years ago through to 2023 as well. People suffered and still suffer to this day. We know our lands are poisoned. We know the radiation fallout killed our loved ones. We know the fallout contaminated our country, our traditional lands, but also our families and our people who move through those traditional lands. We know that our home, the remote community, the station that I live on, in the middle of Australia, had high levels of radiation fallout. Dad passed on 2017, the day or the month after I had come back from presenting in this very room at the 2017 negotiations that happened. I got back into Australia in July. That year, Dad had passed as well. So it's important for myself to continue on the legacy of his story and to talk about the impacts felt by First Nations peoples and our community in particular in remote South Australia and in the centre of Australia as well. Next slide, please, Renee. I can click. I want to acknowledge these amazing old women who have been a part of my life for decades, but they were also survivors and witnesses of those British nuclear tests. We are the ones that know the real human impact of nuclear. These amazing old women were the ones who lived and who were there at the time the ground shook and the black mist rolled and that illness fell over our community. These amazing women speak very strongly and spoke very strongly about those impacts. They have the lived experience. We are grateful that the treaty recognises survivors and recognises the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on Indigenous peoples across this globe. Our stories have so much in common, and we share those stories with each other. The way nuclear weapons states and most of their allies talk about nuclear weapons, it's like they are totally divorced from the reality of what these weapons do and the harms that are felt by people, but also by our traditional country and our lands, our plants, our animals. The treaty was achieved through the humanitarian initiative to humanise the reality of these bombs. The treaty success from now and into the future must continue to bring the expertise, experiences of those of us who know what they do. And our stories are real, our stories are experienced, our stories are felt. For 70 years for us in Australia, in 1953, but also the program continuing through the 60s as well. These stories are very real. The treaty marks nuclear weapons, or they make nuclear weapons illegal, but also puts obligations on states parties to make things better and important for the people and for our land, and these are our traditional lands as well. We want the recognition by the governments of the day of the harms and what they have imposed on our communities and on our people and on our traditional lands. We want the respect, and we want to start the conversations around repair, how we need to work together to fix the damages that are there. The scars are evident, the scars are on our people, and the scars are on our traditional lands. It is encouraging to hear the scientific community calling from opening of records. These are very important. We need to know the stories of how the human rights, it's our human rights to have the access to our medical records. There's a lot of misgap data in Australia of the records of our First Nations peoples or our Aboriginal people of Australia. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this space as well. It is beyond time for this to be happening, where things are closed or lost conveniently or been burnt in a fire or whatever excuses they make. These records need to be available. Unless we have access to the full information of the people who inflicted these harms and these nuclear harms on our people and land, we cannot know how to address and how to fix these. We need to know. We need to be sitting around those tables. We need to be having those conversations, because we are the solutions to the problems of what we have impacted and felt. We want more research on the health impacts, and we want more research on the environmental impacts. And impacts, I talk about intangible cultural heritage as well. Bombs removing chapters of our stories, what we call our wabar, our jogorba, in the Western Desert area of Australia. These stories are important to us. How do we bring them back? These will never be brought back. We want our contaminated lands to be cleaned up, to be removed of all the contamination that lays there still to this day, 70 years after that impact. We must be involved as Indigenous owners of the land. We want an apology. We want action. We want governments to recognise what they have done. We need state parties to work together to get moving on Articles 6 and 7. Our elders are passing, and this work on victim assistance and environmental remediation is crucial before we lose our elders. And we need all governments who haven't yet to join this treaty, including my own country, Australia. They have a responsibility to sign the ban if they want to do anything on nuclear weapons. Joining this treaty must be the #1 priority. I'll go to the next slide, please, Renee. This gives some indication of where Australia is and where the test site of Emu Field took place. We are very isolated, we're very remote, and the two mainland tests of Totem 1 and Totem 2 were at the Emu Field test site. Totem 1 was the test that took place over the traditional lands of my late father, Karina Lester, and those amazing old women who were leaders. They saw and they experienced that test, the ground shaking and the black mist rolling. There's no excuse for being out of sight, out of mind, to not hear the voices of First Nations peoples of this country that I live in Australia. It's a struggle each day to try and get our voices and our messages across to governments to hear the harms and the impacts felt. When you look at a map like this, you see very clearly in Australia that there is mining, where uranium is mined on First Nations traditional lands. Tests have been taking place on First Nations traditional lands, and waste is an issue. And often First Nations peoples of our country in Australia are always felt or feeling the impact of nuclear waste and our traditional lands to be that waste dump. So just within our state of South Australia, there have been many extremes and many examples of where First Nations peoples have been impacted by the testing, the mining, and the waste issues that are felt across this globe as well. Next slide. I want to end with a quote from my late father, where he says, "We heard it here, loud and clear, and felt the ground shake. We've seen the radiation fallout over our camp. It was moving very quietly and very deadly." Finally, to the observers, please double your efforts to sign this treaty. And to the states parties, thank you for being on the right side of history, for committing to repair the past and to protect the future from these terrible weapons. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lester, for that very personal and emotional and moving presentation.